why engaging children in literature at a young age is important. Why is that important?
Children should have literature as early as possible in the form of stories which are told to them, read to them by parents or any other adult or any child indeed older than they are who can read. And the reason they should have these stories, along with nursery rhymes and other such things, is that it plays upon their imaginations and it gives them a chance to understand the difference between reality and fantasy, and particularly fairy stories, which are vital in the imagination of a child, the imaginative life of a child. And what a fairy story does is take the child's imagination into extraordinary realms. Even when the story is illustrated, even if there's illustrations in the story, the child's view is often quite different from the illustration. And that, the value of that is beyond measure. It operates in a similar way to music, where music evokes the imagination in a really special way. So literature is vital in the development of a child's life.
When the imagination is evoked, is stimulated in that way, or it is ignited in that way, what's happening? What growth is happening to a child? What benefits are occurring?
What happens is vocabulary. Children get the idea of vocabulary. They get the idea of character. What is a good person or a bad person? If there's a wicked fairy or a good fairy. The story of Cinderella, for example, is filled with archetypes of, the little girl who's sad and lonely, and the horrible stepmother and the horrible stepsisters. And from this knowledge of characters, they start to apply values. So they see things, they make moral constructs, if you like. They get the idea of good, bad, evil, strength, virtue, weakness. All of these things come through story. They may not be able to tell you that unless you actually ask them questions, but through the intense listening, which is essential in the early stages, that's how they start to build all these images. Later, they can write their own stories. And I have a very good example, because I had a 5-year-old here the other day who wrote a story. And the story was about a ballerina, a princess, a mermaid, and a fairy. And the fairy woke up one morning feeling very angry. So she covered herself in green. She made her hands green, and she made her skin green, and she made her wings green, and her dress, and she went to bed in a tree, so no one could see her. That's an extraordinary concept for a 5-year-old. And that hasn't happened without literature.
And I think the very interesting point that you made is that literacy and literature is as much about listening as it is about speaking and writing.
Unless children learn to listen to stories and focus on the listening, they don't really get the idea of the way the story works. There's a contemporary view that children should be tweeting each other and computering to each other while the story is being told, giving their reactions. That is completely and utterly artificial. That is short-term brain development. When you're listening to a story and you're concentrating on the story from beginning to end, you're setting up long-term focus, long-term concentration. This business of the short term is the very thing which is destroying deep reading and deep listening.
The whole philosophy underpinning our approach, the reading studio, which is what we're calling it, is that children learn best when engaged in the story. So all our teaching, if you like, is going to be integrated into the stories. Because the idea that children learn by doing, worksheets or drilling that is unrelated, that is completely unrelated to the story or to the narrative, or for that matter, an informational text, has proven to be not necessarily a good way of teaching.
Let's look at I would respond to that by saying, if you want to examine the history of any civilization, storytelling and music and dance are the three integral parts of a civilization. Telling stories, singing songs, dancing. The telling of the story is thousands and thousands of years old, and it was about listening to the story, concentrating on the story, and having nothing that interrupted the story. So this idea of children commenting and being involved in what I would call peripheral activity, entertainment, worksheets and colouring in and all that sort of stuff, has nothing to do with learning. There's nothing wrong with it, but don't get it confused with the real business of what listening to stories is about.
In your opinion, children who do have a rich childhood full of story and music and dance, what benefits do they have as opposed to a child who doesn't have that rich experience?
Right. Children who have a rich experience in music, literature, dance and the like have an opportunity to heighten all of those things which keep the brain alive, but not only that, keep the spirit and the heart and the soul and mind alive, especially creatively. So children learn to solve problems, learn to think creatively, learn to interact with the story, learn to engage in aspects that the story might suggest. So the story can present things to them. Once they have a full grasp of the story and you actually question them about what's going on in the story, that's when we start to understand what they get from the story and how in the very early stages it's real. The story is real for them. You know, Cinderella is a real person, the Three Little Pigs really exist, and the Big Bad Wolf and Little Red Riding Hood or whatever it might be, all of those stories really exist. And it is a huge mistake to ignore the traditional stories in favour of this watered down rubbish that sometimes passes as children's literature. You'll generally find that people who write so-called children's literature, that is very mediocre, politically correct, what I would call middle American children's literature, they're generally interested in money, not children.
Yeah, the creative thinking. I mean, what strikes me is that it's the attitude that is established at a young age. It's towards learning and towards literature that is so important. If a child comes to literature or comes to learning as if it is a chore, as if it is a series of mechanical tasks that must be achieved, and that is what learning is, then they will be approaching learning in a fairly joyless manner. And it's the imagine, as you said, it's enacting, it's stimulating the imagination, which brings joy to learning.
A good teacher will stimulate a child to the point where the child will want to read. There'll be so much interest in the literature, and if the literature is of quality and it's treated seriously, the child will want to read. And there's no doubt that children do have a sort of a reading readiness stage because they start to ask questions, particularly when adults spell words and they want to know what the words mean. So that business of encouraging a desire to read and then making reading regular so that a habit is formed, that you cannot imagine a day when you don't read, because reading is so wonderful.
And when children reach that reading readiness stage, the approach that is, well, I guess the approach that they take at that point is so critical, because it either can flip them into someone who enjoys learning and reading for life, or at that stage, the foundation set where they actually perceive reading as a chore, and therefore, for years to come, it's seen as something that's not enjoyable. So what the actual teaching approach at that point in time is crucial
Yeah.
to their ongoing development.
Yeah. Setting them up appropriately, and as I said before, giving them a reason to want to read. I want to be able to do that.
So I think you probably answered that question, but how, in your opinion, how do you best engage young children in literature?
My view is you engage children in literature by exposing them to literature early, by exposing them to books, to nursery rhymes, to songs and dances, music, so as early as possible.
And you've answered this question again, but I'd like to make the point. It is critical. It's not just any literature. You have to be quite selective in what sort of books you teach, you read to children. As you say, there's a lot of rubbish out there.
Yeah. Well, I am very fussy about the quality of the literature, and I think there are some wonderful authors who write brilliant literature. Maurice Sendak, if I'm allowed to mention names.
Okay.
Sendak is a wonderful children's author. There are a lot of great authors out there. I'm not a great fan of the American retellings of the classic tales, where all the hard detail is left out.
Because it's too scary.
Yes, that's right.
Or politically incorrect.
Yes, politically incorrect. And all the women look the same. All the women have blonde hair with blue Alice ribbons, and life is beautiful and meaningful for them, and butter would melt their mouths. That's not real. So I mean, I don't want to mention the person's name, but I'm sure I'm making it very clear about whom I'm talking. So I think that is repulsive. I think the invention of their own characters is interesting enough, but when they start to meddle with traditional stories, it's offensive. So, people like the Grimm's brothers and Charles Perrault, the French storyteller, their work is like a painting or like architecture, or it's fixed. And you can make of it what you will, but please don't think that you can alter it. So, and children for hundreds of years have dealt with those things. Why suddenly children can't deal with that, I have no idea. But yes, it is important that they get quality literature.
Let's move on to a point that I know you're deeply passionate about, and that is the approach. It seems to me over the last 10 years that the industry that has been built up around, and government policy that has been built up around seeing literacy purely as encoding and decoding words and basically ticking boxes with regard to standardised testing. It may show that children are acquiring skills, but it is not showing anything beyond that. It's not teaching them. It's not showing that children are developing the ability to listen, or to comprehend, or to have a yearning and love for learning, which is so critical for further evolving, ongoing development. Drilling and standardised testing, what are your views?
Standardised testing satisfies the lowest common denominator. What standardised testing does is it gives you a series of things that you can teach children, so-called teach them.
Such as phonics.
Yeah, and then measure it and tick boxes. Standardised testing has nothing to do with education. It has nothing to do with literacy or numeracy. It's a fake way of letting people know that your school is doing very well. Now, I think it's wrong to confuse standardised testing with testing. Testing children is really important. You have to find out what they know. What standardised testing does is break things down into component parts that have no context. So children see nothing in context. It's rather like the concept of holistic learning, Holistic learning is very fashionable. It's on the other side of standardized testing, where in every lesson you try and find everything about every other subject that the child can know at the same time. I was recently talking to someone about this who said that, for example, when I'm talking about breathing in singing to children, that could be physical education. So it shows you how deeply stupid these people are who think of these things and who have no concept of what education is really about. So standardized testing has successfully seen the demise of good, concentrated, solid teaching in favour of teaching little blobs of information and ticking boxes at the end of the year when the school is assessed.
And this is particularly seen in the aspect of literacy, where they've taken one important but narrow part of literacy, and that is phonics, and the industry has sort of seen, okay, this is what's the most important thing, and they've basically said, and that leads into this whole industry around drilling for presumably standardised testing, but also because that's what they think literacy is. And I think what we are trying to do is show that literacy is much more than that. It comes back to the context of the book.
What you're trying to do is reintroduce the concept of reading stories for their own sake and what it does for the child. Not taking p and k and saying that 45,000 times, which has nothing to do with anything other than saying k or p. It's like the old music worksheets where children had to spell notes, C-A-B-B-A-G-E, it was cabbage. It's not teaching you anything about music.
And look, the last question I want to ask, which you've touched on already, is the notion of, the influence that technology is now playing in the development of children. We've spoken about deep literature, or sustained reading, and it seems to me that children today who are being bombarded with stimulus from they're multitasking, they're reading a little paragraph here on the internet and they're texting someone, they're watching TV and they're playing a computer game all at once. When children don't have that sustained deep engagement with reading, they're missing out on something, aren't they? They're not really having that, they're not developing that analytical and creative learnings that can occur when you do deeply engage with a book.
Okay. Unless there is some engagement regularly at a deep level with reading, then children are only skimming the surface. They're not really getting into the way literature works. There's nothing wrong with all the things they do technologically, and to be computer literate and do all that stuff is wonderful. But it shouldn't be seen as a substitute. Nothing is a substitute for something else when it comes to things like music and dance and literature. And these things, music and dance and literature, don't improve, they change, right? James Joyce is not an improvement on Wordsworth. Wordsworth is not an improvement on Shakespeare. They're different. What technology does is it improves itself, it gets better and better. But that doesn't mean to say that the literature changes, or painting changes, or music changes. And what children need to know is there is a huge tradition of the way thought has been organised, and that is reflected in literature. And so when you're reading a book, you are getting the author's most intense and most concentrated thoughts. And this is a wonderful thing for children to be able to do themselves. So I can also have thoughts of this nature, and I can put those thoughts down on paper too. So that's what they miss out on if they don't have deep reading.
The last question relates to creative thinking. Now we're living in an era where the ability to think creatively has never been more important, in my opinion, because we, as people, have access to infinite information. We're all, there's limitless information out there. So we're not going to be, as individuals, advantaged by having previously, people who had access to information had a greater advantage over someone else who didn't have that access. We live in a world where we all, theoretically and realistically, have the same access. So it's our ability to think creatively with that information that's so important. And it is my belief that through literature and music and dance, that's how we develop that creativity.
Correct. Through engaging children in literature, music, dance, all those things, what we do is we give them a chance to make a distinction between knowledge and information. And what has happened with the information boom is that knowledge has taken a backseat. Knowledge comes obviously from information, and the business to be able to sort that knowledge out and to make sense of it is called, in my view, wisdom. And so what we really do is we give children literature so they can become wise. And in their wisdom, they can create their own stories. With their knowledge of the vocabulary, their knowledge of the way a story works, they can write their own stories. In the same way, we teach children music so they can write their own music. And in order to do that, they need to know a lot of music. They need to know a lot of literature in order to write their own stories, and good literature. So that is the creative element. And that creative element carries over into all other areas of thinking. So that once a child understands the structure of a story, that gives them a structure for argument, for logic, for reasoning, for sequencing, all those sorts of things that they need to exist and to think creatively.
Brilliant.